I didn't know my life was about to collapse the night I walked in after midnight, still smelling like drywall dust and overheated wire, thinking the hardest part of my day was already over. A job that would net Tate Electrical nearly $40,000 had run long. The kind of job you take because winter bills don't care how tired you are. I came home imagining one cold beer, maybe catching the end of whatever game was on ESPN, and falling asleep on the couch with my boots still on. That's when I heard them. Ethan and Brianna were in the kitchen, voices low, trying to be careful, but not careful enough. I froze in the dark hallway, one hand still on my keys, my shoulders aching from a 12-hour day, listening to my husband and the girl I had raised tear down what was left of my world like it was casual conversation. "Dad, you need to just leave her already," Brianna said, like she was talking about returning a sweater that didn't fit. "Lana has been waiting forever, and she actually has money now." Lana Morrison. The high school golden girl Ethan never fully erased from his stories. The one who always showed up in the background of his memories like a song you can't get out of your head. The one who'd come back to town 5 years ago with a used car lot and a shiny silver BMW, acting like she'd never left. "It's complicated," Ethan replied, and I could hear the little scroll click of his thumb on his phone, probably checking engagement on the latest post he'd begged Brianna to help him film. "Your mom built the business, but half of everything is mine in a divorce. And Lana and I have been careful. We just need more time to move the money." Move the money. My money. The money I earned crawling through attics and basements, getting shocked and burned and cut, while the man who swore he loved me smiled into a camera and called it our life. Brianna laughed softly. "Mom's such a loser. Lana takes you to real restaurants. Mom thinks Olive Garden is fancy. It's embarrassing." I stood there in my own hallway, in the house I'd paid on for 15 years, realizing the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the cruelty. The way they talked about me like I was a problem to solve, like I wasn't a human being who had loved them hard enough to break herself for them. And in that moment, I didn't walk in. I didn't scream. I didn't demand answers. I turned toward the garage, toward my workbench, and I started planning. Because I'm an electrician, and when something is wired wrong, I don't guess. I trace it back to the source, and I shut the whole system down. My name is Linda Karishma Tate, and for most of my adult life, I lived by one rule. If you build something with your hands, you don't have to beg anyone to value you. I was 39 when I started Tate Electrical, with a second-hand van, a tool belt that had belonged to my stepdad, and a phone number written on scrap paper that I taped to the dashboard. I wasn't born into money. I wasn't born into connections. I was born into a family where you learned early that stability wasn't something you inherited. It was something you wired into place yourself, one job at a time. By the time I met Ethan Tate, I already had calluses on my palms and a reputation for not cutting corners. Ethan was the opposite of me in the way that felt relaxing at first. He was charming without trying. He could talk to anyone, waitress, banker, stranger at a gas station, and make them feel like they mattered. He was good looking in that clean, small-town way. He had this easy laugh that filled a room, and the first time he looked at me like I was the only woman on earth, I remember thinking, maybe I can finally stop being the strong one for 5 minutes. We met at a community fundraiser. I'd been hired to check the electrical setup because the venue's breaker kept tripping. I was crouched behind a panel in my work jeans, hair shoved into a messy bun, sweat at my temples, when Ethan appeared with a paper plate of cookies and said, "You're the first person here doing actual work." I didn't even look up. "Then you're standing in the wrong place." He laughed. Not offended, not threatened, just amused. Like my sharpness made him more curious instead of less. After that, he showed up everywhere. Coffee shop I stopped at before job sites, hardware store, the small gym by the river. It felt like fate, until I realized later Ethan was the kind of man who liked to win things, attention included. He told me he worked in marketing, Said he wanted to build a brand. It sounded ambitious. I respected ambition. Back then, I didn't know the difference between ambition and appetite. When I got pregnant with Brianna, Ethan proposed. He did it in front of his parents' house, under a porch light that flickered because the bulb was dying. Something I noticed immediately because I notice everything that doesn't work. He held out the ring like he'd rehearsed the angle of it in the mirror. He looked at me like I was supposed to cry, and I did. Not because the ring was big, it wasn't. Not because the moment was perfect, it wasn't. I cried because I wanted to believe in a future where I didn't have to carry everything alone. His family loved me in the beginning, in that shallow, polite way people love someone who can be useful. Ethan's mother praised my work ethic. His father called me a tough girl, like it was a compliment. At dinners, they asked about my jobs, my contracts, my plans, then looked at Ethan like he was the one providing. Ethan didn't correct them. He never did. The first years of marriage were a blur of diapers, invoices, early mornings, and Ethan's endless ideas. He wanted better cameras, better lighting, better furniture for his content. He started posting online, short clips of our home life, my cooking, Brianna's milestones, framing it like we were this perfect, glowing family. When I told him I didn't want Brianna on camera all the time, he pouted and said I didn't understand branding. When I told him my business needed cash flow more than new decor, he said I was stuck in survival mode. Small comments, small dismissals. The kind you swallow because you're tired, and because you love them, and because you keep telling yourself it's not worth a fight. And then Brianna grew. She grew into a girl with Ethan's social confidence and my stubborn jaw. She was smart, sharp, and hungry for attention in a way that made me proud, until it started turning into entitlement. Sometimes I'd come home late from a job, hands smelling like copper and insulation, and Brianna would barely glance up from her phone. Ethan would be filming himself in the kitchen, laughing into the camera like he'd done something heroic by making pasta. I'd tell myself it was just a phase. I'd tell myself families go through seasons. I'd tell myself, at least we're together. The night I stood in the hallway listening to them talk about moving my money, that was the moment I finally understood something I should have seen years earlier. We weren't together. I had just been the foundation they were standing on, and they were already planning how to kick it out from under me. Once you hear the truth once, you start hearing it everywhere. That night in the hallway didn't end when I went into the garage. It followed me into the days that came after, into every silence, every sideways glance, every moment that suddenly felt rehearsed. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't look at Brianna differently, not on the surface. I packed lunches, I asked about school, I nodded through Ethan's rambling updates about engagement numbers and growth opportunities. I played my role the way I always had, but inside, something had shifted. I started noticing patterns I'd ignored for years because they were inconvenient to question. Ethan had always been loose with money, but now I saw how strategic that looseness was. New subscriptions I didn't recognize. Consulting fees that didn't tie to any actual work, charges that hit our joint card at odd hours, always explained away with a shrug and a smile. Business dinner, he'd say. Networking. You know how this stuff works, Linda. I did know how stuff worked. That was the problem. Brianna changed too. Or maybe she'd been changing all along, and I was just late to see it. She stopped asking me for help with homework. Stopped riding with me to job sites on weekends like she used to when she was younger. When I'd ask how her day was, she'd give me clipped answers without looking up from her phone. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me, not with affection, with evaluation, like she was measuring something. Ethan's family started inserting themselves more too. His mother began dropping comments that sounded harmless, but landed heavy. You work too much, Linda. Men don't like feeling secondary. A woman should protect her marriage, not just her business. She never said Ethan needs to do better. It was always me. One afternoon, I came home early after a job canceled last minute. I heard laughter in the living room before I even opened the door. Brianna's voice, bright and animated, mixed with Ethan's low chuckle. They fell quiet when they saw me. Too quiet. "What's funny?" I asked, forcing my tone to stay light. "Nothing," Brianna said quickly. "Just TikTok stuff." Ethan didn't meet my eyes. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to Ethan scroll on his phone beside me. The blue glow reflected faintly in the window. He hadn't touched me in weeks. Not really, not with presence. "You ever think about the future?" he asked suddenly. "I build for it every day," I said. "That's not what I mean," he hesitated. "I mean, do you ever think about changing things up, taking risks, starting over somewhere else?" Portland. Boston. The words from the kitchen came rushing back. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just wondering. People evolve." I turned toward him then. "And what happens to Tate Electrical in this evolution?" He smiled like I was adorable for asking. "You'd land on your feet. You always do." I realized something in that moment that made my chest tighten. Ethan didn't see my strength as something he admired. He saw it as something he could rely on, exploit even, while he chased whatever felt more exciting. The next day, I noticed my laptop had been moved. Just slightly. The angle was off. A notification popped up that I hadn't seen before, an unfamiliar sync alert tied to our shared cloud storage. I didn't click it. Not yet, because deep down, I already knew. And when you're standing at the edge of a truth big enough to change your entire life, there's a moment where you decide whether you're going to look away one last time or finally open your eyes. That was the week I stopped asking questions out loud and started collecting answers instead. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, through passwords that suddenly change, through receipts that don't line up, through conversations that stop the moment you enter a room. And once you start looking, it doesn't take long before the truth stops hiding. I waited until a morning when Ethan and Brianna both left in a rush. Him late for a content meeting, her late for school because she couldn't find the jacket I'd washed and folded the night before. I watched their taillights disappear down the street, then locked the door behind me and stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, heart beating slower than I expected. I wasn't panicked. I was focused. I opened my laptop and signed into our shared cloud account, the one Ethan had insisted on years ago because families shouldn't have secrets. He'd never bothered changing the settings, never imagined I'd actually look. The first thing I saw was his email, not one account. 3, work, personal, and one labeled with nothing but a string of numbers. That one was the key. 3 years of messages spilled open like rot under fresh paint. Long threads between Ethan and Lana Morrison. Not flirtation, not nostalgia, but intimacy. Plans, jokes, complaints about me written with the casual cruelty of people who believe they're justified. She doesn't get it. She's obsessed with work. Once the money's moved, it'll be easier. Hotel confirmations followed. Restaurants I'd never been to. Photos of them together. Her hand on his chest, his smile wide and careless, posted to a private account he'd never told me about. I felt my body react before my mind did. A dull ringing in my ears. My fingers went cold on the keyboard. My stomach tightened, not with shock, but with recognition. So this was it. But the affair wasn't the worst part. It never is. I opened the financial folder next. Invoices labeled consulting. Transfers broken into amounts small enough to avoid alerts. Payments to an LLC I didn't recognize until I pulled up the registration. Owner, Lana Morrison. My breath caught. They hadn't just betrayed me. They'd been stealing from me. 2 years worth of falsified expenses. Inflated material costs, equipment purchases that never arrived, nearly $60,000 siphoned out of Tate Electrical, money I'd earmarked for Brianna's college fund, for a new service truck, for the slow, careful future I'd been building brick by brick. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. I thought of the nights I'd come home so exhausted, my hands shook while I ate. The weekends I'd missed because a job ran long. The times I'd said no to vacations because we should be smart this year. Smart. The final blow came from a thread I almost didn't open. An email chain between Ethan and Tina Walsh. Tina, my former employee, the one I'd fired 3 years ago for stealing supplies and lying to my face about it. The one Ethan had defended a little too hard at the time. The emails laid it out clean and simple. Tina had reintroduced Ethan and Lana at a high school reunion. She'd convinced Ethan he deserved more. She'd helped structure the fake companies. She'd helped move the money. And then, buried halfway down the thread, like an afterthought, were messages about Brianna. Casual, calculated, devastating. Mentions of timing. Jokes about genetics, references to how useful it would be in a divorce. My vision blurred. They were talking about paternity, about how Brianna had Lana's eyes, about how a test could limit my rights, about how biology could be used to cut me out clean. 17 years. 17 years of scraped knees, late night fevers, driving lessons, school projects, soccer games, parent-teacher meetings. And they'd reduced it to leverage. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. No rage, no screaming, no tears, just clarity. I backed everything up. Screenshots, PDFs, timestamps. I labeled folders the way I label breaker panels. Clean, precise, undeniable. When I was done, I shut the laptop and sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock above the stove. I thought about walking into the garage and smashing something. Instead, I made a list, because this wasn't an emotional problem. It was a systems failure, and systems don't get fixed by panic. They get shut down. That night, when Ethan came home, I kissed his cheek and asked how his meeting went. When Brianna complained about dinner, I apologized and offered to make something else. They didn't see it. They didn't feel it. They had no idea that the moment I opened that email chain, their world had already ended. They just didn't know yet. Shock doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like calm so deep it scares you when you notice it. For the next few days, I moved through my life like everything was normal. Because on the surface, it was. I woke up early, I packed lunches, I drove to job sites and argued with inspectors and signed off on permits. My hands stayed steady. My voice didn't shake. Inside, though, my mind was replaying everything on a loop. Every moment I'd dismissed. Every time I'd chosen peace over questions. Every instinct I'd overridden because loving them felt more important than being right. At night, I lay awake next to Ethan and studied the rise and fall of his chest. I wondered how long he'd been able to look at me, knowing what he was doing. I wondered if guilt ever crossed his face when he watched me balance invoices at the kitchen table, or when I'd turned down a vacation because it wasn't the year for it. He slept easily. That hurt more than I expected. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. What did I miss? Was it when he'd stopped asking about my jobs? When he'd started calling my business your thing instead of ours? When he'd learned to talk about love in captions instead of actions? I replayed Brianna's childhood like evidence in a trial. Her laughter, her first steps, the way she used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. I searched those memories for cracks, for signs that she'd never really been mine in the way I'd believed. And that thought, mine, made my chest ache. Because regardless of biology, I had been her mother in every way that mattered. Or so I thought. The first confrontation came sooner than I'd planned. Ethan was standing at the counter one evening, scrolling through his phone while I cooked. The light from the screen caught his face at an angle that made him look younger, almost innocent. For a split second, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, and then he said it. You ever think you might be too controlling with money? I turned off the stove, slowly. What do you mean? I asked. He shrugged, still not looking at me. Just, everything has to go through you, the accounts, the approvals. It's like you don't trust me. I laughed. I didn't mean to, but it slipped out, short and sharp, and the sound surprised both of us. I trust systems, I said evenly, not vibes. He finally looked at me then. His expression hardened just a fraction. See, that's what I mean. You talk like everything's a transaction. I stepped closer. And you talk like accountability is optional. The air between us tightened. Brianna appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, eyes flicking between us. Can you not do this right now? She said. It's exhausting. Exhausting. I stared at her. The girl whose college fund had been quietly drained, whose future had been used as a bargaining chip, and felt something in me finally crack. I'm not doing anything, I said softly. I'm just asking questions. Ethan scoffed. You're always asking questions. That's the problem. That was when I understood something essential. They weren't afraid of my anger. They were afraid of my clarity. That night, I went into the garage and sat at my workbench, surrounded by tools that had never lied to me. Copper wire, voltage testers, blueprints, things that behaved exactly as expected when you respected their rules. I thought about blowing everything up, about confronting Ethan with the emails, the receipts, the theft, the paternity discussions. I imagined his face draining of color, Brianna's shock, the chaos. And then I imagined the aftermath, the gaslighting, the tears, the promises, the way they'd try to turn it into my fault for looking. No, I wasn't going to hand them the chance to rewrite the story. Instead, I did what I've always done when something breaks. I assessed the damage, I isolated the problem, I planned the shutdown. By the end of the week, I had copies of everything backed up in 3 places. I opened a new bank account in my name alone. I quietly spoke to my accountant under the guise of year-end prep. I documented timelines, cross-referenced transactions, and mapped out exactly how the money had moved. I didn't cry, not once, because somewhere between the kitchen conversation and the garage that night, grief had transformed into something colder and far more dangerous. Resolve. They thought I was passive. They thought I was predictable. They thought love made me weak. They were about to learn what happens when the woman who built the foundation finally decides to step away from it and let the whole structure collapse. Once you stop pretending, the world doesn't get louder. It gets sharper. Every interaction with Ethan after that felt like watching a performance from backstage. I knew where the trap doors were. I could see the wires holding the smiles in place. And the more I saw, the more confident he became, because confidence thrives on the assumption that no one is paying attention. Ethan started pushing, subtly at first. He suggested we restructure finances so he'd have more flexibility. He complained, loudly, in front of Brianna, about how stressful it was to feel managed by his own wife. He started framing himself as the victim, the misunderstood creative trapped by a woman who only understands numbers. Brianna absorbed it like oxygen. She just wants control, Brianna said one night when Ethan wasn't home. She didn't look at me when she said it, just stared at her phone, thumbs flying. Dad says you don't trust anyone because you think everyone's trying to take something from you. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, do you think I don't trust you? She hesitated. Just a beat too long. I think you don't listen, she said finally. You only care about work. There it was. The story they'd agreed on. Ethan's family joined in soon after. His mother called to check in, which was code for interrogation. She asked questions about the house, about money, about whether I'd considered stepping back from the business for the sake of harmony. Harmony for who? I asked calmly. She didn't answer. At a family dinner the following Sunday, Ethan's brother joked, half laughing, half testing, about how lucky Ethan was to have a wife who handled the boring stuff. I smiled and passed the potatoes, because by then, I had already confirmed something critical. The theft wasn't accidental. It wasn't impulsive. It was organized. I spent nights tracing transactions the way I trace circuits, following the flow, identifying breaks, marking patterns. The fake consulting fees aligned perfectly with Lana's travel schedule. The inflated invoices matched jobs where Ethan had insisted on handling client communication himself. And Brianna, she wasn't just a bystander. I found messages, casual, careless, between her and her friends, bragging about Lana's BMW, laughing about how Mom still thinks everything's fine, talking about how much easier life would be once Dad finally left her. That one hit harder than I expected, because teenagers can be cruel without fully understanding the weight of their words. But this wasn't thoughtless cruelty. This was alignment. The escalation reached its peak the night Ethan tried to corner me. We were alone in the kitchen. Brianna was out. The house was quiet in that tense, artificial way that feels staged. "We need to talk," Ethan said, leaning against the counter like he was about to negotiate a sponsorship deal. "I agree," I said. He launched into it without missing a beat. "You're stretched too thin. The business, the stress, it's affecting our marriage." He sighed, practiced and heavy. "Maybe it's time we consider separating for a while, just to reset." There it was. The opening move. I met his eyes. "And the money?" He blinked. "What about it? How do you propose we handle finances during this reset?" He hesitated, just enough to confirm everything. "Well," he said slowly, "legally, half of everything is mine, and I think it's only fair I have access to what I need." I nodded. "Including funds from Tate Electrical?" He smiled, relieved. "Exactly. See? This doesn't have to be ugly." I held his gaze. "And Lana?" The color drained from his face. "Why would you bring her up?" he snapped. I tilted my head. "Just curious." He recovered quickly. Too quickly. "She's a friend. You've always been paranoid." Paranoid. That was the word he chose after stealing from me for 2 years. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I let him talk himself into believing he was winning. That night, I finalized my timeline. By Friday, I'd booked a storage unit across town. By Saturday, I'd spoken to my locksmith. By Sunday, I had a clean plan that didn't require a single conversation, argument, or explanation. Because confrontation gives people room to maneuver. I wasn't giving them room. I was giving them consequences. On Friday morning, while Ethan was at work and Brianna was at school, I changed the locks. I moved their belongings with surgical precision. Clothes folded, shoes boxed, electronics wrapped. Nothing damaged, nothing dramatic. I paid 3 months in advance on the unit and labeled every container clearly. I canceled Ethan's access to our joint accounts, froze the cards, transferred the remaining funds into the new account I'd already opened, and then I left a single note on the kitchen counter. "I know everything. Do not contact me." I blocked their numbers before they even realized what had happened. Then I went to work. I had 3 jobs scheduled that afternoon, routine calls that kept my hands busy and my mind clear. By the time I got home, there were missed calls from unknown numbers, voicemails I didn't listen to, messages I didn't read. The silence felt clean. For 3 days, I lived like a ghost in my own life. I ate when I wanted, slept when I wanted, watched what I wanted. No tiptoeing, no explanations. But small towns don't allow clean exits. Within a week, the story spread. Linda kicked her husband and daughter out. Linda had a breakdown. Linda was abusive. Linda was hiding something. Ethan and Brianna made sure their version traveled faster than the truth. Friends reached out, family called. A pastor I'd never spoken to left a voicemail about forgiveness. I ignored them all, because while they were scrambling to control the narrative, and they had no idea how exposed they already were. People think the darkest moment comes when the betrayal is revealed. They're wrong. The darkest moment comes after, when the noise dies down, when the adrenaline fades, and you're left alone with the weight of what you've lost. The first night after the locks were changed, I slept like I hadn't in years. Deep, dreamless. My body finally believed the threat had passed. The second night was worse. The house was too quiet. No footsteps, no doors opening and closing. No muffled laughter from Brianna's room. No Ethan pacing while rehearsing captions into his phone. Just the ticking of the clock and the low hum of appliances I'd installed myself. I walked through the rooms slowly, barefoot on hardwood floors I'd refinished with my own hands. The living room where Brianna used to sprawl with her homework. The kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 rushed dinners. Her bedroom door, closed now, empty behind it. I didn't go in. I wasn't ready. That was when the doubt crept in. Not about Ethan. That door was sealed shut. About Brianna. 17 years doesn't disappear just because the truth turns ugly. I remembered the way she used to grip my finger when she crossed the street. The night she called me from a sleepover because she was homesick and whispered, "Can you come get me, Mom?" I'd gone without hesitation. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my palms into my thighs, breathing slowly, the way I do when I'm working live wire and can't afford to shake. Did I go too far? The question scared me more than anger ever could, because if the answer was yes, there was no undoing it. That was when the calls started coming again. Not from Ethan or Brianna, they were blocked, but from everyone else. Friends who'd just heard some things. Relatives who wanted to check in. People who had never once asked how I was handling a 60-hour work week, suddenly concerned about my emotional state. I let the phone ring until one name appeared that made my hand pause. Mick Sullivan. Murphy's Tavern sat at the edge of town like it had always been there and always would be. Mick had been running it longer than I'd been alive. Built like a fire hydrant, voice gravelly, eyes sharp. He'd known me since I was Brianna's age, had poured me my first legal beer, and told me not to waste my life on people who didn't deserve it. I answered. "You alive?" he asked, without preamble. "Yes." "You eating?" "Yes." A pause. "You want to come down and have a drink?" I hesitated. Then I said yes. Murphy's was almost empty when I walked in. Late afternoon lull. Just Mick behind the bar and an older man in the corner feeding coins into a video poker machine. The smell of beer and old wood wrapped around me like familiarity. Mick slid a glass toward me without asking. "You sure you want to burn it all down?" he asked, wiping the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. I took a sip. Let it settle. "They already burned it down," I said quietly. "I just stopped pretending the house wasn't on fire." He nodded once. No judgment, just understanding. I told him everything. The affair, the money, the fake companies, the emails, the plan to use paternity to erase me from Brianna's life. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it. I just laid it out, piece by piece, like evidence on a table. Mick listened without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "That's felony territory," he said. "You could have them arrested." "I know." "Why haven't you?" "Because prison would make them martyrs. Because courtrooms create villains and victims, and they were already good at playing that game. Because what I wanted wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. I want them to understand what they've lost," I said. "I want them to live with it." Mick's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile. "Your old man would have said the same thing. Sometimes the worst punishment is letting people see who they really are." I left the bar feeling steadier, but the night still hit hard. Back home, I finally opened Brianna's door. The room smelled faintly like her shampoo. Posters still on the wall, a sweater draped over the chair like she'd be back any minute. I sat on the bed and picked up a framed photo from her nightstand. Us at the lake when she was 10, both sunburned and smiling. My throat tightened. This was the lowest point. Not rage, not grief. Acceptance. The understanding that loving someone doesn't protect you from what they choose to become. That raising a child doesn't guarantee loyalty. That doing everything right doesn't mean you'll be treated right in return. I lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling until the light outside faded. And somewhere in that darkness, something shifted. I realized I wasn't lonely because they were gone. I was lonely because I'd spent years being surrounded by people who didn't see me. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a victim, because victims wait for things to be fixed, and I was done waiting. They thought the story was over. They were wrong. The real reckoning hadn't even begun. The shift didn't come with fireworks. It came with a phone call. I was replacing a breaker panel at an elementary school. Knees on cold tile, hands steady, mind finally quiet. When my foreman, Danny, jogged up behind me with his phone in his hand and panic written all over his face. "Linda," he said, breathless. "They're at the shop." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. He turned the screen toward me. The security feed showed 3 figures in the parking lot of Tate Electrical: Ethan, Lana Morrison, and a man in an expensive suit clutching a briefcase like it held something fragile and dangerous. "There's a sheriff's deputy with them," Danny added. "They've got papers." I handed him my tools and stood. The drive back felt longer than it should have, not because I was nervous, but because I knew what was coming. They weren't here to talk. They were here to force my hand. When I pulled in, they were waiting like a firing squad. Ethan stood closest, wearing the calm, injured expression he saved for authority figures. Lana leaned against her silver BMW with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for anything. The lawyer hovered between them, stiff and pale, briefcase pressed tight to his side. The deputy stepped forward. "Linda Karishma Tate? That's me. You're being served." The envelope was thick, heavy, the kind of weight meant to intimidate. I opened it right there. The complaint accused me of unlawful eviction, theft of marital assets, emotional abuse, defamation, interference with business relationships. They wanted half the business, the house, damages, attorney's fees, nearly $400,000. "This is ridiculous," I said calmly. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ms. Tate, my clients are prepared to settle quietly if you're willing to negotiate reasonable terms." "Reasonable," I repeated. Ethan finally spoke. "We want the house and half the business. It's only fair." Fair. The word landed wrong, sharp and hollow. "That's an interesting definition," I said, "especially from someone who's been stealing from my company for 2 years. Lana scoffed. "Nobody stole anything. Ethan deserves better than what you gave him." I looked at her. Really looked. The expensive shoes, the practiced posture, the desperation hiding under confidence. This wasn't a woman who'd built something. This was a woman who'd taken. "I'll respond," I said, folding the papers. "Count on that." As I drove away, I saw it. The moment their certainty wavered. Because they'd expected panic, begging, a breakdown. They hadn't expected me to look prepared. That evening, I called my lawyer. Patricia Kowalski had grown up in this town. She was sharp, relentless, and allergic to nonsense. When she spread the evidence across her desk, bank records, emails, receipts, her smile was thin and dangerous. "This is fraud," she said. "Wire fraud, conspiracy, theft." "I don't want them arrested," I said. "Not yet." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you want?" "I want the truth on the record, public, unavoidable." Pat leaned back, considering. "Once we countersue, everything becomes public." "Good." We worked fast, precise, surgical. And then, finally, I did the one thing I'd been avoiding. I ordered the paternity test. The result came back 2 days later. Clear, final, unforgiving. Brianna was not my biological child. The confirmation didn't feel like a punch. It felt like a lock clicking into place. Proof that the lies went deeper than betrayal, that the foundation itself had been compromised from the start. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at the paper until the words blurred. 17 years. I'd raised her because I chose to. I'd loved her because love isn't biology. It's time, effort, presence. But choice cuts both ways, and she had made hers. The next morning, I made mine. I approved Pat's countersuit. Fraud, theft, conspiracy, a full forensic accounting, and yes, the paternity issue. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because they'd already decided to destroy me publicly. I was just done protecting them from the consequences. When I left Pat's office, the air felt different, lighter. Like I'd finally stopped carrying weight that was never mine to begin with. They thought they were in control. They thought I was cornered. What they didn't understand was this. They had just forced me to stop being quiet. And once the truth is spoken out loud, on the record, under oath, it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. It becomes a reckoning. They thought the countersuit was a bluff. That was their final mistake. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Family court doesn't like lingering fires, especially when accusations start flying in every direction. Ethan's attorney had filed for emergency relief, claiming I was unstable, vindictive, and emotionally dangerous. He wanted restrictions, silence, control. Instead, they walked into a courtroom that was already full. Pat had done exactly what she promised. Every local reporter, every blogger who covered court filings, even a few familiar faces from town who had just happened to hear something interesting was coming out today. When Ethan, not fully, but enough. The judge, Honorable Patricia Henley, took the bench and immediately set the tone. Calm, direct, unimpressed. "Counsel," she said, "let's proceed." Ethan's lawyer stood first, launching into a carefully rehearsed narrative. Emotional abuse, financial control, intimidation, social media harassment. He painted me as a bitter wife who had snapped when her husband tried to leave. Judge Henley. Then she turned to Pat. "Miss Kowalski?" Pat stood, calm as a blade. "Your Honor," she said, "this entire filing is retaliation. My client discovered a coordinated scheme involving marital infidelity, financial fraud, and theft from her business. This hearing exists solely to intimidate her into silence." She began laying it out. Bank records first, dates, amounts, transfers, the fake consulting fees, the shell company registered to Lana Morrison, 2 years of theft neatly documented, then the hotel receipts, then the emails. The courtroom went quiet in the way it does when people realize they're witnessing something irreversible. Ethan's face drained of color. Lana stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Their lawyer stopped taking notes. Pat saved the last exhibit for the end. "Your Honor," she said, "there is one more matter relevant to motive." She handed the clerk the document. The paternity test. I didn't look at Ethan when she read it into the record. I didn't look at Brianna, who wasn't present, thankfully. I watched the judge's face instead. Professional. Still. But not unmoved. "This indicates," Pat continued, "that Ms. Tate raised this child under false pretenses for 17 years, and that the respondents were preparing to weaponize this information during divorce proceedings." That was when the room shifted. Not sympathy. Judgment. Judge Henley leaned forward. "Counsel for the respondents, do you have any evidence of threats, stalking, or abuse?" Silence. "Well," she pressed. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the social media posts are factual," Judge Henley interrupted, "and protected speech. Motion denied." She paused, then added, "Furthermore, I am referring the financial evidence to the district attorney for review." That was it. That was the moment everything collapsed. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were waiting. By evening, the story was everywhere. Local business owner exposes family conspiracy. Fraud, affair, and deception uncovered in divorce battle. Ethan lost his sponsors within 24 hours. Brands don't like scandal unless they can monetize it, and he wasn't valuable enough to be worth the risk. Lana's dealership went into freefall when partners demanded audits. Tina Walsh, exposed publicly as the architect of the scheme, disappeared for exactly 3 days before police picked her up in Boston on unrelated charges that suddenly weren't so unrelated anymore. Ethan's family stopped calling, not because they believed me, but because belief was no longer required. The evidence spoke for itself. And Brianna? She tried. She called from an unknown number, left messages, sent texts that didn't go through. When she finally reached me through Pat, her apology came wrapped in confusion and fear. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Some consequences can't be softened without becoming meaningless. 3 weeks later, charges were filed. Fraud, conspiracy, theft. Mugshots ran in the paper. Ethan's image, once carefully curated, was reduced to a booking photo under harsh lighting. Lana looked smaller, older, stripped of her confidence. The town moved on the way small towns always do, fast, then not at all. They stopped whispering. They stopped speculating. The truth had settled. And me? I went back to work. Tate Electrical got busier. People trust the person who didn't lie, when lying would have been easier. I hired 2 new electricians, bought the truck I'd been saving for, paid off a line of credit I'd carried longer than I should have. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply walked away, calm, intact, and finished. They lost their reputations, their relationships, their illusions. I lost a marriage, a child I thought was mine, and the version of myself that believed love alone could hold a system together. What remained was quieter, stronger, and finally, mine. Healing doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up quietly, on ordinary mornings, in small choices, in the absence of chaos you once thought was normal. A year passed, not all at once, not dramatically. It passed in invoices paid on time, in jobs finished cleanly, in evenings where I cooked for myself and didn't brace for criticism, in nights where my phone stayed silent, and for the first time, that silence felt like peace instead of punishment. I rebuilt my life the same way I'd built everything else, methodically. I kept the house by the lake. I refinished the back porch and started drinking my coffee out there every morning, watching the water change color as the sun climbed. I learned the shape of my days without anyone demanding explanations for how I spent them. I dated, slowly, carefully, not because I needed someone, but because I finally trusted myself to choose differently. I learned the difference between charm and character, between attention and respect. And most importantly, I learned this: walking away is not weakness. For years, I thought endurance was the same thing as strength, that staying, no matter how much it cost, proved something noble about me. I was wrong. Strength is knowing when the system is broken beyond repair. Strength is choosing truth over comfort, clarity over denial, freedom over familiarity. People still ask if I regret it. If I regret not forgiving, not reconciling, not keeping the family together at all costs. The answer is no, because forgiveness without accountability is just permission. And reconciliation without truth is just another lie. I loved deeply. I gave fully. I built honestly. What they did with that love was their choice. What I did after was mine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't exposure. It isn't courtrooms. It isn't even consequences. Sometimes the best revenge is waking up one day and realizing you're no longer living in reaction to people who broke you. You're living in alignment with yourself. My phone still doesn't ring much. My house is still quiet. My life is smaller, but it's solid. And every time I lock up my shop at the end of the day, hands tired, back sore, I smile, because nothing in my life is built on lies anymore. And that's freedom.